While a prairie on its own can do a hell of a lot, being fragmented from its associated environments like certain kinds of wetlands means that when it's damaged or degraded, it cannot get the help from the ecological functions that those associated ecosystems provide. Unmanaged prairies often become woodlands without two things. One, frequent fire. Two, defragmentation. So we need to reduce fragmentation, right? Right. But we can't just smack a woodland down right next to a prairie necessarily. This gives certain woodland plants like black cherry here a direct point of invasion onto the prairie. Yes, given certain climate conditions, even native woodlands plants can become invasive to a prairie in the absence of wildfire. And while many species will cross the threshold from woodland to prairie aggressively, some can't really cross it at all without some medium. If a squirrel wants hazelnuts from the prairie, they risk exposing themselves to every predator in the area. However, when you reach the edge, the transition of an ecosystem called an ecotone, you tend to experience something oh so creatively called the edge effect. That is, the species of this system might not be able to outcompete the species of the system over due to differing light, soil, and water conditions in the process of that transition. When that next system over is something like, say, a busy highway, the next system over has quite a barrier to cross, not just for all the cars zooming by, but for the sidewalk itself. Compacted soil all around it filled with debris where only opportunistic invasives can survive. If this were right up against the prairie, every single seed that could get to this sidewalk via a pant leg or a truck would have a great foothold and a direct route for expansion onto the prairie. If this were prairie plants battling directly against invasives, it would be a hard-won battle, but the invasives would win. It's like the battle for Berlin. The Bolsheviks, the invasive plants would just keep coming. Without constant laborious maintenance, the prairie would vanish before the invasives or even species from the woodlands right next door. So what's stopping them? Well, in order to get to the prairie, they've got to get through the savanna first. So why don't they? Well, they do. Plenty. Because savannas are even rarer than prairies. They're delicate ecosystems. But historically, prairies and woodlands have fought over the same land. That means, for the last 10,000 years, these two environments have had plenty of collaboration. First, the woodlands deploy a wave of small, often rhizomatous, often fruit-bearing trees and shrubs. Think hazel, hawthorn, plum, sumac, elderberry, even willow. These have strong and fast roots that start to break up the roots of the prairie plants, and they can start to wither the grasses from the top down, kind of like buckthorn does to everything indiscriminately. Now, larger hardwood trees have a foothold, and also the species from the woodland or from the prairie have a base camp from which to start utilizing the resources from either side. Then they eat all the berries of those shrubs, they go and crap them out everywhere, and the process continues thusly. Behind the prairie savanna margin, as the shrubs advance, larger trees now have less work to do before they can fully establish a population. Unlike if they grew on a prairie, big hardwoods won't just outgrow themselves until they can't compete anymore. But let's not forget about the climate. All those shrubs, they hardly stand a chance to the wildfires. So the trees that grow behind them have to be fire tolerant. Black oaks, bur oaks, and white oaks are the most common in this case. And even if one can't quite survive a fire, its root system can survive underground for generations, sending up new saplings every chance it gets. These so-called oak grubs were a bane to the early settlers when they arrived. It seemed that once the acorn hatched, you just couldn't get rid of the oak tree. But without the fire that forced these adaptations, those oak grubs can be a bane to the ecosystem as well. Those woodlands on the other side of 31st Street used to be but an extension of this savanna. Now, this savanna is practically an extension of those woodlands. It hasn't had fire in far too long, but it still serves some of its functions. This savanna integrates and insulates the prairie over there to the woodlands over there. It contains plants from both of them and some conservative to them. And if it has plants from both the prairie and the woodlands, that means it also has the associated insects, fungi, microorganisms, and what have you to those plants. Should one environment be damaged or degraded, this savanna provides hope that it can return. and it can protect one environment from another's damage or degradation. If invasive plants wanted to get here from the woodlands or from the road, they'd have to cross the oak and sunflower and sometimes on fire savanna to get to the prairie first. And if a wildfire were to try and get to the woodlands, it has to get through the savanna first. And because of the savanna, an animal from the prairie, like a woodcock, can gain access to some of the bounty of the woodlands, like the berries of a briar. So what it's really starting to seem like is prairies, woodlands, savannas, you, me, him, her, us, they, y'all, we, I, are not all that different. Some hippy-dippy crap, eh? Well, what I'm trying to say is our human societies and cultures have managed to not only survive, but often prosper due not only to our competition with each other, but our collaboration. I'm talking trade, man, transportation and communication. Just like the fungi under the ground have allowed other plants to prosper by exchanging nutrients and chemical signals between them, our societies grow because of the trade in between them. And just like Constantinople or Singapore, the most important centers of trade are where the most cultures or ecosystems collide. So the savannas provide us with a richness, a productivity that we've just forgotten. These are some of the most productive and endangered ecosystems in the whole world. If you're ever in the Luss Hills in Iowa, climb to the top of one of them and take a look at all that farmland. Those crops can do one thing, make one food for one species and their domestic animals, and it'll never be quite as useful as it used to be ever again. The soil there, it's spent. It's been rent hard and heavy. The soil on a prairie, it's soft, it's fluffy, it even smells good. And besides that, prairie air is clean, prairie water is nutritious, prairie plants are fruitful. And if we fail to devote ourselves to being part of those systems that brought the settlers here in the first place, our fate will be the same as the prairies and the woodlands that balance them on the other side of the savanna. Speaking of which, in the next episode, let's see how the woodlands balance everything out here. But until then, I want you to think on what we've discussed today and take care of yourself, good care of yourself and your planet. Because remember, the planet lives and dies with us.